Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Tonight is June 4th, 2024, and our class tonight will be on the 80th anniversary of D-Day, also known as Operation Overlord and Operation Bagration.
So, of course, this is the 80th anniversary of D-Day and Operation Bagration. It's actually the 6th. It's going to be the 80th anniversary of D-Day, June 6, 1944. And then Operation Bagration happened later in the summer. But it was something that still coincided with it, and we wanted to include it here. And what we're going to be learning today is, of course, the events leading up to D-Day and the Soviet perspective on the opening up of the Western Front. Of course, as Marxist-Leninists, we always want to know what the Soviets thought of different developments, and we always get the American version of D-Day. So we'll also learn about Operation Bagration, the lesser-known Soviet offensive corresponding to actions on the Western Front in 1944, and Operation Overlord, or as it is better known, D-Day itself, and what it did for the war effort. This is a series that we've been doing on 80th anniversaries of different battles throughout the Great Patriotic War, or World War II as it's known throughout the world. We started with 80th anniversary of victory at the Battle of Stalingrad last year, and then did 80th anniversary of the Battle of Kursk, the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Kiev, and earlier this year, we did the 80th anniversary of the victory at Leningrad. So without further ado, we'll get into this class. This is the lead up to D-Day and the Soviet perspective. So American intervention in World War II. Prior to 1941, the United States refused to militarily intervene against fascist forces in the world. This was true for the Spanish Civil War, as we saw in the class a little while ago, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and the Nazi invasions into Czechoslovakia, Poland, Belgium, Netherlands, France, etc., throughout the beginning stages of World War II. But on December 7th, 1941, Imperial Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Infamous day in history. We all know what happened. But this brought the U.S. into World War II, declaring war against Japan. Germany then declared war on the United States on December 11th, allowing for the U.S. to enter the war in Europe against Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and other Western Axis powers, in addition to the war against Japan in the Pacific. And it allowed us to do that because before there was a general isolationist sentiment within the United States. We didn't want to get involved in another European war like we had in World War I. We wanted to just let them sort out their own things. And then when Hitler declared war against the United States, it gave Roosevelt an excuse to go, okay, well, we can declare war back. I don't have to unilaterally decide to send us into Europe. So that's the reason for that. But from December 22nd, 1941 to January 14th, 1942, the Arcadia Conference was held in Washington, D.C., with the United States and the United Kingdom, and Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, was agreed to. And remember, this was Vichy French controlled. This would be the first U.S. intervention in the European theater. So in North Africa and Italy, in North Africa, you had Operation Torch, which was launched on November 8th, 1942, and it was the Allied invasion of French North Africa, as we said, targeting Morocco and Algeria. And you can see over on the maps where those are at. This marked the first major operation in which American and British forces jointly engaged in the European and North African theaters during World War II. This successful campaign helped to secure the Mediterranean and pave the way for the subsequent invasion of Italy. Then there was Operation Husky, ending fascist Italy. Following the North African campaign, the Allies turned their attention to Italy, beginning with the invasion of Sicily on July 9, 1943, under Operation Husky. This was followed by the mainland invasion on September 3, 1943, starting with the landing at Salerno. The campaign aimed to remove Italy from the Axis powers, weaken German defenses, and establish a foothold for further operations in Europe. And this was also brought up and the Battle of Kursk class, because that's around the time where it happened. Soviet military advances between liberation of Ukraine and D-Day. So between the liberation of Ukraine in late 1943 and the early 1944 and the launch of Operation Bagration on June 22nd, 1944, the Soviet military made significant advances on the Eastern Front. Following the recapture of key cities like Kiev, the Red Army continued to push westward, liberating territories such as Crimea and advancing into Eastern Europe. The Soviets conducted several offensives, including the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, which inflicted heavy losses on the German forces and reclaimed vast swaths of land. And you can see over on the side that operation. These advances not only weakened the German defensive positions, but also boosted Soviet morale and strategic positioning. The sustained pressure on Eastern Front disrupted German supply lines and forced the Wehrmacht to divert forces away from other critical fronts. This relentless Soviet progression set the stage for Operation Bagration, a massive and meticulously planned campaign that aimed to destroy the German Army Group Center. The success of Operation Bagration further accelerated the Soviet advance towards Germany, marking a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The prelude to D-Day, the Tehran Conference. So this took place in November 1943 in Tehran, Iran, and it was a conference between Stalin from the Soviet Union, Churchill from the United Kingdom, and Roosevelt, of course, from the United States, the big three. It was Stalin's very first encounter with Roosevelt and his second one with Churchill. The main purpose of the conference was to discuss the opening of a second front in Europe through a cross-channel invasion into France. Stalin and Roosevelt had to fight off the reticence of Churchill, who favored operations in the Mediterranean area, the soft underbelly of the Axis. It's not hard to understand that Churchill had in mind the interests of the British Empire in Greece and the Balkans. Nevertheless, decision was agreed upon for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, to take place in the spring of 1944. Now, to counter the Western world's attempt to ignore the Soviet effort in Operation Overlord, while we're spotlighting American involvement, a few slides are dedicated to the Soviet participation, and the following excerpts showcase the Soviet Union involvement. For 4 days in November to December of 1943, as World War II raged, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met in secret in the Iranian capital of Tehran. The Tehran Conference was the first time all three Allied leaders had ever been face to face. Roosevelt's top military advisors had long pressed for Operation Overlord and knew that Stalin, who had been assured for several years that an invasion was imminent, was losing patience. Most ominously, according to biographer Nigel Hamilton in War and Peace, FDR's Final Odyssey, 2019, there had already been rumors of serious peace feelers between Nazi Germany and Russia in August and September 1943, leaving open the possibility that Stalin might simply abandon the Allies and cut a separate deal. Roosevelt not only wanted Stalin to stay the course against Hitler, but to expand Russian operations into the Pacific and join the fight against Japan. What Stalin wanted most was a definite commitment that his allies would open up the long-promised Western Front in France, forcing Hitler to split his troops and fight on two fronts. He also wanted a firm date and agreed on May 1st, 1943, as part of the bargain. He agreed to launch an offensive on the Eastern Front to coincide with D-Day, so that Hitler couldn't easily divert troops to repel the invasion. Quote, what was the turning point of World War II? Is it possible to pick one event, great or small, in this immense conflict and say, this was the decisive moment? That's the question I recently posed to some of the war's finest historians. End quote. Quote, the majority of the historians I talked to, including American, British, German, and Japanese academics, agreed that the turning point of the war was to be found within the conflict in the Soviet Union, reminding us of the importance of the fighting in the East, where the decisive fate of the Second World War was really going to be decided. They just disagreed about when this moment occurred. Was it Stalingrad? Was it Kursk or Operation Barbarossa? It's not hard to see why they argue this point. In terms of numbers alone, the scale of the war in the Soviet Union was staggering. Take the comparative death toll between the West and the East, for example. The British and Americans lost no more than 800,000 dead between them during the war. The Soviets, however, suffered a death of 27 million people. And with that, we'll stop for our first round of questions and comments.
Thank you, comrade. As always, please try to limit your comments to 2 minutes. We will give you a 60-second warning. And also, please try to keep your comments and questions about the subject material. With that being said, comrade, you have the floor.
I just wanted to say my grandpa, he was from Poland. Well, he was from Russia, but he was Polish. My grandparents were from Poland. They're Polish, but they lived in Russia. They came to America in the 1920s. My grandpa fought, he fought for America in World War II. He was at D-Day. He was Polish, and he fought for America. Just a fun fact. So there were immigrants who fought for America during this anti-fascist struggle.
Thank you, comrade. Comrade Andrea Canada, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just slightly annoying to, like, when the West negotiates, I always get this feeling that they need to be not only helping, but on top, or need to gain something if they make a union with anybody. And I just find it very disingenuous. I don't know if anybody else feels that. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade Andrea. Well, and definitely there were pushes and pulls, both from the British, the Americans, and the Soviets for everything. And I see, comrade Angelo, your hand went up at that. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, all I want to say is that while this war was going on, there was a congressman named Truman. This is important for you to know this. And what he said at that time, let them kill each other. If the Germans are winning, we'll be on the side of the Soviets to fight the Germans. If the Soviets are winning, we'll be on the side of the Germans to fight the Soviets. That is Truman, who later became the president. Now you know why the Cold War started. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade Angelo.
Yes, thank you. I remember reading Ben Steele's The Marshall Plan, how he countered the narrative that the Soviet Union was denied a second front earlier. And it said, and I think accurately, that we denied them that so that way we could be destroyed as much as possible by the fascists who were orchestrated against them. Or oriented against them. But he says instead it was a matter of preparation resources. And that not only that, but Stalin was aware of this tactic, of this betrayal of people who need help or whatever, because he did the same to some Polish uprising or something like that. And so I was curious if any of our experts here presenting the class have something to say about those comments and about whether or not they were able to launch a second front earlier and they just chose not to until the turning point of the war happened.
There's been heavy debates on this subject, but there was definite a pushback for opening any other front in Europe, which Stalin had pressed for a long time. And they were generally not heeded too much, but after victories like Stalingrad and Kursk, the Allied war planners began to more seriously consider. Of course, Churchill wanted that second front to open in the Mediterranean because of, as stated, the interests of Greece and the Balkans to the British Empire. But also the American planners, while they did have the Pacific theater, had also been more open to that idea of a second front in Europe. And I see, Comrade, your hand went up. Did you want to respond to that?
Yes, comrade, I do. This last comrade here mentioned the uprising in Warsaw in August 1st, 1944. Okay, and that's what he mentioned. He said the Soviets wouldn't help. That is somewhat of a slander, that the Cold War began about the Soviet Union and Poland. Okay, the thing is, at the end of Bagration, the Soviets had liberated the entire Bielorussia and got to the Poland border. and they liberated a city in Poland called Lublin. But then it was it. They were extended too far. They couldn't go any further, the supplies and everything. So when they got to this first city, they put together a government, a leftist government, obviously, for the liberation of Poland, right? The bourgeois government of Poland in London didn't like that. So they instructed the people in Warsaw to do uprising in order to take power before the communist or the leftist would come, and that led to the massacre of the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944. It wasn't the Soviets' fault. It was the bourgeois' fault because by anti-communism. That's all.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade California, you have the floor. Go ahead.
My grandfather was part of the 101st Airborne that dropped in Normandy. This was like the night, 24 hours before the soldiers landed on the beaches. But he didn't get to go because he had too many kids and one wife he was leaving behind at the time, but he was in uniform. So the fact that he he had his duffel bag and everything ready to go, and he was part of this. He was, I looked at his stuff books and stuff that he gave to my father. And you know what his job would have been if he had landed? He would have been somebody who would have been a really ripe target for picking. Was a track finder, meaning he was a source of intelligence to track German tanks and movements. So that would have been not only a help to the Western Anglo-Saxon allies, but to the Soviets as well. So I'm glad I made it to this class because even though he didn't go, but he almost did, and he was in uniform at the time. Secondly, this is just a great class so far. I'm glad we're covering it. I really actually didn't know about the Soviet initiatives that were happening at the same time, actually. So I'm glad I'm not missing this.
Thank you.
Just all good welfare.
Thank you. Comrade from Oregon, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to talk real quick, I guess, about the pride in what we did then and sort of being patriotic about it. I think it's one of my great uncles was involved with D-Day. I'm not sure if it was in the planes or on the boats. But I have a great uncle that was involved with D-Day, a great grandfather that was involved in the Battle of the Bulge, and then another one that fought in the entire Pacific War on the USS Birmingham from start to finish. And I'm proud of that. It's a rare justified U.S. military intervention. There's only been a handful of them in the U.S. history. And, we were fighting against fascists finally, like people did when they volunteered and fought them in the Spanish Civil War and other places. And I think sometimes the modern left tries to deny people a sort of patriotism about this. And there's these developing ideas that somehow the Second World War was also an inter-imperialist conflict. And it also, you can't be proud about what the United States and the United Kingdom did in that war. And the Allies were just out to get their own slice in that war. And I don't agree with that. I think that we can be proud of that war. We can be proud of our people that fought in that war. And, I'll go ahead and leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade for New Mexico, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to branch off kind of what Angelo was saying earlier. But one thing I was listening to earlier was talking about calling World War II the Great Patriotic Class War because it's an extension of the Russian Revolution in the fact that the Western Allies wanted to use the German fascists to dismantle the Soviet Union and further smash the revolution. That's all I had to add.
Thank you, Comrade. Okay. Comrade Georgia, you have the floor. Go ahead.
What was the name of that book that you talked about, the Marshall Plan or something? Book you mentioned?
I think it was called the Marshall Plan. Did you mean
the book you mentioned about the Marshall Plan?
Yes. Did you mean not Hamilton?
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, it's the Marshall Plan. I think the author's name is Ben Steele. It's very widely lauded among academics. and it is lauded because it is anti-communist, pretty anti-Russian, but it's a useful perspective because he tells the truth sometimes. So I recommend it, at least for that.
This is my dad talking to me. He said that his dad saw the Soviet Union lesser of a threat than Nazi Germany at that point. And, my dad was just saying, even today, my dad is voting for Trump, but the fact that so many people who vote for
90
Trump
seconds.
do not want war with Russia, because that would mean the end of America as we know it.
Okay.
Secondly, I just want to say, if you look on comment that in a lot of ways, yes, if you look at it through the eyes of how Lenin would see the Great Patriotic War, it is all but a chapter in the Great Patriotic World Revolution.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Because of the success of Stalingrad and Kursk, actually the other allies were becoming concerned that the Red Army could overrun the whole of Europe. So that was another thing that was in the Stalin's favor in trying to get that second front open.
Thank you, Comrade Karen. Comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Okay, I actually got something to say this time. I have two relatives who fought in this war. Two. My great uncle Billy and Claude Crenshaw. They both fought in this war against the Nazis. So I have great pride in them fighting against the Nazis in this war. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question. We've heard the Pearl Harbor attack was a surprise. And then I know I've heard that it really wasn't a surprise. So was it a surprise? That's my question.
I think that's a teensy bit outside class tonight, but it looks like your hand went up at that. Did you want to answer?
Yeah, just as a brief response, I think it was still a surprise. The only thing that I remember hearing about it was that a lot of our naval forces had been basically centered at Hawaii because they thought they were about to go into a war. And it was basically like a last hurrah before that. But I've also heard sometimes that wasn't true. So I'm not completely sure. Maybe somebody else has a better answer.
And I do know as well, it was most of the ships minus the carriers that were there at Pearl Harbor, as they were out on a sortie that day, I believe, when that all happened. We'll take one more hand, Comrade Angelo, and then we do need to move on.
Yeah, all right. Two issues. Number one, I don't know if people know that there were negotiations going on with Japan at the time of the bombing. In fact, the negotiators just had left Washington, D.C., and that's when the bombing started. So it was all pre-planned. But what I wanted to mention is that communists went to World War II. They volunteered. You should all know Gus Hall was in the U.S. Navy. General Secretary Gus Hall was in the U.S. Navy, and he was in the Pacific District. So these young, I call them pishpots, these young pishpot leftists who run on the internet, who spout they're criticizing everybody. They weren't around. They don't know. Maybe if they joined the union and became working class, they could understand what Gus Hall went through. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. And with that, we do need to get back to the presentation, so please keep your hands up, and we will get to you at the next discussion round.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about Operation Bagration itself. The biggest Soviet military operation of 1944 was Bagration. It was named by Stalin after a Georgian general. You know, Stalin was a Georgian himself, okay? Oh. Hero of the Patriotic War of 1812 against Napoleon. Remember that when Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, they called it the Patriotic War. And that is why Molotov in June 22nd, 1941, upon Barbarossa, he named this war the Great Patriotic War. Okay? It's related somewhat. The goal of Operation Bagration was to liberate the entire section of the USSR still under Nazi occupation, and to restore the Soviet frontiers from the Black Sea to the Barents Sea. That's the one in the north. Bagration was closely coordinated with Anglo-American plans for the long-awaited Second Front in France. In early April 1944, Stalin was informed of the approximate date of D-Day, the cross-channel invasion of France. And on April 18th, he cabled Roosevelt and Churchill that, quote, as agreed in Tehran, the Red Army will launch a new offensive at the same time so as to give maximum support to the Anglo-American operation, end quote. The Red Army was an expert in maskirovka, that means military deception. So in order to draw the Wehrmacht attention away from Bielorussia, a highly successful maskirovka campaign was elaborated to convince the Germans that an Anglo-Soviet invasion of Norway, of all places, was in the offing. You can see the picture of Bagration on the right. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Stalin congratulated Roosevelt and Churchill. And later, I think it was 6 days later, he told the Pravda that the invasion of France was, quote, unquestionably a brilliant success for our allies. One cannot but recognize that the history of warfare knows no other similar undertaking in the breadth of its conception, in its giant dimensions, and in the mastery of its execution. Invincible Napoleon shamefully failed in his plan to force the Channel and to conquer the British Isles. Hitler, the hysteric, who for 2 years boasted that he would force the Channel, did not even venture to carry out his threat. Only the British and Americans, he forgot Canadians, by the way, succeeded with flying colors in carrying out the gigantic plan of forcing the Channel and of landing in force on the other side. History will record this action as an achievement of the highest order, end quote. That is Stalin saying all that. That's very deep congratulations, you know. Occupied Belorussia was a core of Soviet guerrilla warfare with 140,000 partisans organized in 200 detachments. On January 19th and 20th, Soviet partisans launched a furious and relentless wave of attacks on the Wehrmacht. Or remember that in the East, there were 1 million soldiers of the German army whose duty was to guard the railroads. Okay, so the partisans on that time in Bielorussia, they attacked all the railroads. No train was moving. That's how come it helped so much the Red Army then. The Red Army's main ground attack began on June 23rd and was a stunning success. Attacking across a 500-mile wide front, Soviet forces smashed through Army Group Center, the bulwark of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. Remember, the Army Group Center is the one that was directed to Moscow. Army Group North was to Leningrad. Army Group South was to Kiev and Stalingrad. Minsk, the capital of Bielorussia, was liberated in early July, and 100,000 German troops were encircled and trapped. In the south, the first Ukrainian front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konev, liberated Lvov. Remember Lvov, the birthplace of Bandera, on July 27th. Together with Marshal Zhukov and Rokossovsky, Konev would later lead the assault on Berlin. We saw that last class, remember? By the end of July, Army Group Center had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, with over 30 divisions destroyed and over 450,000 casualties. The back of the Wehrmacht had been broken by the Red Army. As Churchill famously said in 1944, quote, "The Soviets tore the guts out of the German army," end quote. That was Churchill himself, the enemy of Bolshevism. However, the destruction of Army Group Center did not come cheap. Fighting was ferocious, and the 4 Soviet fronts involved in Bagration suffered huge casualties. I believe they were like 500,000 or maybe more. But the magnitude of the Red Army's victory was tremendous. The entirety of the USSR had been liberated, except for a section of the Baltic states, no wonder. In the south, the Red Army was heading straight for Belgrade, Bucharest, and Budapest, the capitals of Yugoslavia, Romania, and Hungary. In fact, when Soviet armies shattered Army Group Center, they achieved their greatest single military success on the Eastern Front. For the German army, it was a catastrophe of unbelievable proportions, greater than that of Stalingrad. At Stalingrad, the symbol of Soviet success had been the iconic newsreel footage of the surrender of the Sixth Army's commander, Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus. In the case of Operation Bagration, the symbol of capitulation was the image of 57,000 German prisoners of war, led by the generals right in the front, being marched through the streets of Moscow on July 17th, 1944. So, in the summer of 1941, at the launch of the Barbarossa onslaught, Hitler boasted that his soldiers would hold a parade through Moscow. Well, it took 3 long years, but their wish was finally granted.
They told the world they would get to Moscow, and now they've got there. Over 57,000 German soldiers captured by the Red Army in one campaign in White Russia. Only a part of the total number taken at such famous places as Vitebsk, Minsk, Bobruisk. They were to march through Moscow between 2 stations, part of their journey to prison camps. There were many German generals to lead the procession. Lieutenant General Müller, commanding the 4th German Army. Major General Hamann, German commandant of the garrison of Bobruisk, former commandant at Orel. Major General von Hertmanndorf, commandant of Mogilev. Major General Klammert, commanding the 260th Infantry Division. General Feldkers, commanding the 27th German Armored Corps. General Galwitzer, 53rd Armored Corps. Major General Engel, 45th Infantry Division. Major General Schmidt, head of the 9th Army Engineer Service. 19 German generals altogether. Now they are to march as captives along the streets of Moscow, through which they hope to march in triumph. was a Red Army general. A sorry collection of brigands they look, watched by the people of Moscow whom they were planning to enslave. So ends for them another German dream of conquest. This in the east of Europe compares with what British and Americans are doing to German armies in the west. Imagine for yourself, what would you be doing today if Germans had marched victoriously in Moscow and in your own city or town or village? Make up your mind now that Germany shall never be given the chance to try again and sweep your streets as they swept the streets of Moscow.
Yeah, thank you. I'm envious here of people talking about their relatives who fought in the war. I did too, my great grandfather, but on the other side, he was very mocked. So I just thought it was funny. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Comrade, did you have another question or comment?
Sorry, my great uncle Tom was he was in a Navy pilot in the Pacific during World War II. Just I mentioned that. Thanks. I forgot to put down my hand.
Oh, not a problem. Thank you. Okay, Comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Especially want to give a special shout out and salute to those of you who are new and anybody else whose relatives or grandparents or great grandparents who helped to fight against fascism. Even ourselves weren't there, but through our grandparents, there's a lot of pride in that. Secondly, just wanted to say, if you're a person who's new to us and you have an inch of patriotism, we welcome that to our group. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is phenomenal. I really like the interactive. I just think it's neat. It's unique. It is structured in a way that promotes good education. So hopefully that answered a couple questions.
Thank you, Comrade.
I actually got a saber from Uncle Billy when they raided a Nazi warehouse full of them. The saber's from the 17th century. It's a family treasure. I actually have it. It's in West Monroe. Just saying, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of people don't really know this, but the Allies, they set up decoys in different battlefields. Like they had tanks made out of rubber that you could pick up. They were physically, they had fake artillery and stuff. So when the planes flew overhead, it would look like real soldiers and artillery and stuff. And that helped them on D-Day because they tricked them thinking they were going to go to one place, but they went to another. And also, you see the Ukrainian flag, the Soviet Ukraine flag in the background here. We mustn't forget that, Ukrainians used to be Soviet. They fought in World War II against fascism. They had fascists within Ukraine, but the majority were Soviets and fought for fascism as well. And we shouldn't be anti-Ukrainian. We should be anti-fascism.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade Tennessee, I do not believe you've spoken yet tonight. You have the floor.
Yeah, I don't know if this is too far afield, but someone brought this up. I've read in a few places that the Allies were afraid, with good reason, that because communism was, so much stronger at the time, and the Axis powers were collapsing, that most likely it would be people's democracies that took their place in Western Europe. And that has to do with why the Allies chose to open up a second front. So I was wondering if that's valid, or how valid is that?
I would say it's pretty valid. There is, of course, a multitude of factors that went into what was going on at the time, and there was also negotiations between people, but I do think that is a definite factor that's not really discussed so much in Western academia. Comrade Angelo, did you want to respond to something?
I want to respond. Listen carefully. The resistance movement in Western Europe was run by communists. That's a fact, not an opinion. Comrade Stalin at the 7th Congress of the Comintern told us to go back to our countries and to be the patriots of our countries and to lead the resistance movement against the occupation of our countries. And that's what we did. So that is correct. That is definitely correct. There was that fear that, now remember what happened in Italy. In Italy, the party led the resistance movement, the partisan movement. Their famous song was Bella Ciao, if you ever heard of it. Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao. That was a partisan movement song. The United States got the Pope. Remember, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, who at that time was friendly to the Nazis. Pope Pius XII, and the people that came right after him.
60 seconds.
So he got them to tell the voters in Italy, don't vote for the communists, vote for the Christian Democrats, because they were afraid the communists would have won that election. That's correct.
Also, don't forget what happened with the British return to Greece in late 44, 45. That could probably be a whole other class on that.
Yeah, related to Bagration, one of the pictures that I found and put in the class that had a map of the operation showed Hungarian and Romanian attachments towards the south. And one thing that a lot of people forget about this era and American intervention in World War II is, of course, we haven't declared wars since World War II. And some of the last people we actually declared war against were Hungary and Romania, and I believe maybe it was Bulgaria or another Balkan country that was allied with the fascists at the time. So we've actually declared war against those countries before. And again, a good thing to be proud of. Those were justified American interventions against fascists in the world. And yeah, I'm so glad to hear as well all of the different comrades that are bringing up different veterans in the Second World War. It is something that we should always be proud of, and we can't let anybody take from us. It reminds us of our duties today as anti-fascists. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so to touch on what Angelo was saying and others were saying earlier, okay, for sure, if the Red Army had marched all the way to the Atlantic, you would have had basically popular democracy in France, in Italy, and all of Germany. It's for sure. As a matter of fact, it's interesting that someone after the war had a talk with Stalin and told him, congratulated him on the achievement of the Red Army to go from Stalingrad all the way to Berlin, right? And he said, well, yeah, but Tsar Alexander did better. He went all the way to Paris. So what he meant by that is that the Red Army could have made it to Paris, and it would have changed the course of history, obviously. You know, it was like a kind of a joke for Stalin to say that, but, you know, that's what he had in mind. That's all.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, yeah, I should probably say a little bit about my family since we've given us the opportunity here. I feel like I want to honor them. Most of my uncles were enlisted in World War II. One of them actually enlisted just before the war, not knowing that the war was coming. He told me he never would have done it had he known, but he did it because he had to get out of Boston because people were trying to kill him because it was gang activities. And so he stayed in for 30 years. And, you know, he was also, you know, not so proudly, he was in Korea and Vietnam. Another one of my uncles, he was in the Pacific too, in the World War II. Another one was also in the Pacific in the Marines and survived Iwo Jima, but died later from his wounds and from alcoholism. A third one was in the Navy, and he came back drug addicted, which was very unusual for that generation, but it did happen. So, you know, there were a lot of there were I looked up some of their records. You can find their enlistment
60
records.
seconds.
They all enlisted. None of them went to high school. They went straight to the service because you could see it on their enlistment forms. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, comrades, so we're going to talk about the infamous Waffen-SS Das Reich. On D-Day, what happened? Everyone attending this class must surely be familiar with the infamous Azov Battalion, now called the Azov Assault Brigade, an elite unit of the Ukrainian army that has been in the headlines for the last 2 years. But actually, even since its creation in 2014, you can see the emblems of Azov on the right. The Azov is known for its fanatic ideology of Ukro-Nazism. What is it? That's Nazism with Ukrainian characteristics. Its patch has been seen countless times in the media and online. Where does it come from? It represents the Nazi Wolfangel, which means wolf's hook in German. And that was a symbol of the 2nd Panzer Division, Das Reich, of the Waffen-SS, the elite fighting force of the Wehrmacht. The SS was, at its origin, a paramilitary unit of security and repression, but they created a Waffen-SS, was part of the Wehrmacht. Das Reich was transferred to France in January 1944 after fighting 2 years on the Eastern Front. During the summer of 1943, it played a major role in the failed Kursk offensive. At the time of D-Day, Das Reich was stationed in southwest France in order to be positioned midway between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Upon the D-Day invasion of Normandy by American, British, and Canadian forces, Das Reich was given the order to move north to join the fight next. On its way, it was attacked by the French resistance, which was particularly active in southwest France, which had the nickname of Little Russia at the time. As Das Reich typically did on the Eastern Front, their immediate response was to retaliate against civilians in order to intimidate the partisans. That is when, on the morning of June 10th, only 4 days after the Normandy landings, a regiment of Das Reich named Der Führer fell upon the small, quiet little village of Oradour-sur-Glane and quickly encircled it. SS troops separated the men from the women and children. Men were rounded up and mowed down by a machine gun fire. Women and children were forced into the village church, which was set on fire. SS men were outside shooting anyone trying to escape. Then, Nazi soldiers searched the village for anyone still hiding. And finally, they burned the rest of Oradour to the ground. 197 men, 240 women, and 205 children were martyred by Das Reich 80 years ago. Oradour-sur-Glane has been left untouched for 80 years to serve as a reminder of Nazi crimes against humanity, not only in France, but in all of occupied Europe. It must be noted that in Bielorussia alone, from the summer of 41 to the summer of 44, Nazis burned down 9,200 villages and murdered close to 3 million civilians or 1/3 of the population. Oradour-sur-Glane is frozen in time, a national memorial left the way it was found the day after Das Reich left. 300,000 people visit Oradour in highly strict silence each year. The fate of Oradour is comparable to the one of Lidice in Czechoslovakia 2 years earlier, that was in 1942, when the entire village was massacred in retaliation for the murder of high-ranking SS officer Reinhard Heydrich by Czechoslovakia partisans. So here we are, 80 years later, on the anniversary of D-Day, that's 2 days from now. French President Macron had the audacity to invite Ukro-Nazi President Zelensky for D-Day celebration in Normandy, while at the same time refusing the participation of Russia. And comrades, I want to add something. Just today, I found out that in Brittany, which is a place south of Normandy, there was a maquis, which means a partisan detachment, very strong. And it was ordered to attack the German forces in Brittany, which were 150,000 strong. And they did. And of course, the Germans retaliated and massacred a lot of people. And guess who they sent against the French resistance? They sent Ukrainian troops, the nationalists, the banderistas that were in the Wehrmacht. So it was Ukrainians that massacred French resistance, not only Das Reich, but also in Brittany. Okay, I found that out today. That's all.
Waffen-SS Das Reich. Yet 80 years ago, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had agreed to combine the cross-channel invasion of Normandy with a massive offensive by the Red Army in Belarusia against 214 divisions of the Wehrmacht. That very summer 1944, Churchill himself declared that it was the Red Army who tore the guts out of the Wehrmacht. In December 1944, de Gaulle, who was the French general, met Stalin for the first time in Moscow and told him that French people know they owe their liberation to the USSR. Macron has spat in the face of the entire French nation by insulting Russia and insulting the memory of the 642 martyrs of Das Reich, whose symbol Zelensky's army proudly wears. How could Zelensky set a foot on French soil on the 80th anniversary of the sacred Oradour? And for the lead up to D-Day, there was an operation that took place called Operation Fortitude. This was an operation that was successful in deceiving the German High Command into expecting a landing at Pas de Calais. If you look on the map there, Pas de Calais is that closest point of France that's right next to the southeast coast of England. I believe it's about 25 nautical miles from England to France at that point, which is the shortest distance. Instead, the Allies targeted a 50-mile stretch of Normandy coastline. The plan had two components: Operation Neptune, which was the naval assault phase, and Operation Overlord, which was the broader invasion strategy. Approximately 160,000 Allied troops were to land across 5 beaches: Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha, and Utah, with British and American airborne forces landing inland. You can kind of see from the map the setup there. So on the day of, this operation was actually supposed to be on June 5th, but bad weather in the English Channel delayed it for a day. So the D-Day operation of June 6, 1944, brought together the land, air, and sea forces of the Allied armies in what became known as the largest amphibious invasion in military history. The operation, given the codename Overlord, delivered 5 naval assault divisions to the beaches of Normandy, France. The beaches were given the codenames Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. So the American forces, you can see on the blue on the map over there, landed at Utah and Omaha. And while the 2 British Army forces and a Canadian force landed at Gold, Juno, and Sword. the right-hand side. The invasion force included 77,000 ships and landing craft manned by over 195,000 naval personnel from 8 Allied countries. Almost 133,000 troops from the United States, the British Commonwealth, and their allies landed on D-Day. Casualties from these countries during the landing numbered about 10,300. And one thing to note, at Omaha Beach, that was where one of the more heavier defended beaches the Americans landed at, for a landing force of, I believe, about 23,000 or so. They lost about 7,000 in that day alone. Casualties were very high on that day. There. So continuing from there, the 5 beachheads were not connected until about the 12th of June, by which time the Allies had held a front of about 97 kilometers long and 24 kilometers deep. Cherbourg, which is the port city on the very peninsula up there in Normandy, was captured on June 26. And though the Germans had destroyed the port facilities of that town, which were not brought back into full operation until September, the Allies were able to use their mulberry harbors instead. What these were floating harbors that had been developed that basically extended from the beach out anywhere from up to about 400 meters, to where ships that were capable of delivering armored vehicles could actually disembark on them. These things were capable of holding up of a lot of weight, and actually, if you go towards the Normandy beachhead nowadays, you can see the remains of some of them still there. Caen, a major objective, which is the large city you can kind of see kind of near the Sword Juno beach area, that was not captured or liberated from the Germans until the 21st of July. The Germans had ordered French civilians, other than those deemed essential to the war effort, to leave potential combat areas in Normandy. And while civilian casualties around D-Day and D+1 are estimated about 3,000. You can kind of see how the operation expanded from D-Day itself to about the 12th of June on this map here. And then continuing on, the Allies had an objective that day, which was to capture Cherbourg, Bayeux, Caen, and basically hold that entire Normandy area. They kind of failed in that, but they did capture all of their beach holds, and all of their beach holds held. And they had that tenuous foothold, which expanded when they captured Cherbourg on the 26th of June, and then Caen on the 21st of July. There were a couple counterattacks by the German forces to drive them off the beach. These failed, and one of them on the 7th of August left about 50,000 soldiers of the German 7th Army trapped in the Falaise pocket by the 19th of August. The Allies launched a second invasion from the Mediterranean Sea of southern France. This was Operation Dragoon, which was in the south around Massy-les-Eaux and kind of where Nice and those areas are. And the liberation of Paris followed later on the 25th of August. The German forces retreated east across the Seine on the 30th of August 1944, which marked a close to Operation Overlord. All right, and we will go to our final discussion round. Once again, please have your hands up if you have a comment or question.
My uncle and my father were in the war. They both were on the Pacific Front. My father was a submariner and had some pretty tall tales to tell about his experience. He was on his way to Pearl Harbor. He came into Pearl Harbor on December 9th, 3 days after it hit. So he was involved in that, but then went on to the islands, the Japanese islands. And encountered those depth charges. Like I say, a lot of amazing stories from his time there. His uncle went into what was called the CBs in the Navy, and they are the ones that actually do construction. So he was on the islands making up all of the settlements, driving a bulldozer, making that. And one thing I noticed was that he had a patch of black hair on his back, in the back of the ribs. And I says, "What's that?" And he says, "That's what I got from the Pacific." He said basically it was rot. So, he still had a patch of black hair where because of the heat and the conditions, it did affect his skin. So just want to say they both survived. obviously, but still
60
had their
seconds.
difficulties like all of the veterans did. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Yeah. The only thing I can really point to is my spouse's great-great-grandparents were in the German army during World War I and then fled across to the US after that and took a lamp that we have with us to this day. Comrade, you haven't spoken yet tonight. You have the floor.
Yeah, on my mother's side, I don't know, I don't remember if he's related to me by blood or not, but his name was like Great Uncle Melvin. But I met him when I was younger, and he lived in Long Beach, California, and he was at Pearl Harbor. He was in the Navy. I think there was some kind of ship, military ship, destroyer, battleship, something. Maybe it was called the Nevada. Or no, it wasn't the Nevada, something else. But there was some ship that got hit, and then it was like in the channel, and they had to like beach it because it was going to block the channel or something. I think he might have been on that. And I don't know if he continued fighting after Pearl Harbor and went all the way to the end of the war. I guess he would have to. I don't know the story, but I know he was at Pearl Harbor. So that's my contribution to today's class. There was at least one person in my family who was there. Thank you.
Seconds. Thank you.
Yes, I have a great uncle who fought in the Second World War, and me and my parents were visiting him one day, and as he was talking to us, I noticed that he had a tattoo on his forearm of an anchor. And so after we left his house, I asked my mom, was my uncle, was he in the Navy because of his tattoo? And she said, not only was he in the Navy, but he fought in the Second World War, but that he refuses to ever talk about the war. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess to join in on all of the fun, I would like to say that I do also have family that were involved in the war too. On my dad's side is kind of precarious. It's like I had great uncles that were pilots in the Pacific Theater for America, but then I also had a great uncle that was in the SS because it was like my grandfather, it was pretty much split between family that was still in Germany and family that came here because my great grandfather was in the German Navy, Imperial German Navy in World War One. He was a POW. That's how he came here after he got captured. But yeah, I feel like everybody has some sort of contribution to the past, the history of the country and the nation in the war, of the Great War. But yeah, it's very interesting hearing everybody and their connections to it.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Yeah, so my family emigrated from the Soviet Union in the 70s. My grandfather and grandmother both served in the Soviet military, specifically from early 1944 up until, well, about 1955, 1960, where they both exited the service. My grandfather was 14 or 15 years old, and he was assigned as an ISU 152 loader, and that's just basically a mobile howitzer, and my grandmother was a nurse. And they moved to the United States, and they raised me. But other than that, grandfather really never talked about it. We still have family that lives all in that area, but the majority of my family was exterminated. But we, moved away from that, of course, as soon as we were able to, because multiple wars in a specific zone over multiple periods of time is just too much. But yeah, he passed away about 2 years ago. But he did get to meet his granddaughter, so that's something cool.
Thank you for that, comrade. Comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say two things. The first is, the depiction of D-Day. It's probably the most depicted battle of all of World War II, and there was a real, I'd say, it was before that there were still big D-Day movies, but after like the 90s, they really amped up and almost, every couple of years there was a D-Day movie. There was D-Day in all these video games. There are 5 or 6 Call of Duties that depict D-Day. And meanwhile, at the same time, the depictions of the Eastern Front battles started to wane off. And Stalingrad wasn't recognized as such a turning point battle. People started to think it was D-Day. So there's been a purposeful propaganda push to really take D-Day and make it this battle that won the war. And sure, it definitely played a significant role in opening up the Western Front, and we shouldn't forget about it. But it was no turning point. And I think, honestly, I think we could all deal with a little less D-Day media. There's 1,000 things out there.
60 seconds. Thank you, Comrade. I saw some hands that shot up at that. Comrade, did you want to respond as well?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on what was saying. This is very interesting because, in the presentation, you remember de Gaulle went to Moscow in December 44. He met Stalin for the first time. And he told him straight up, it's historical fact. He told him, French people know they owe their liberation to the Red Army. Okay, that's it. Now, back in those days, in the late 40s or so, there was opinion polls in Europe, like say in France, and they would ask people, well, who played a major role in the war of defeating Nazi Germany? 75% of the people would say the USSR, the Red Army. Today, 80 years later, the same polls will have 75% of people saying it is the Anglo-American who defeated Nazi Germany. It's totally reversed. Why? Because for 80 years, you had an ideological artillery barrage against people, mind, brain, and they got brainwashed into thinking that, okay? And one last thing to say, very important.
Seconds?
Yeah, sorry, but it's important. In 2 days, we got the actual Normandy celebrations, right? Nazi Zelensky is there, invited by Macron. It's expected that Macron going to make a speech. It's expected that in that speech, it's a rumor kind of right now, but it's expected that he's going to announce that NATO troops are going to Ukraine officially. We already know they are there, but he's going to say officially they are sending advisors, meaning NATO troops to Ukraine. Macron will say that in front of Zelensky on 80th anniversary of D-Day. What an insult to the nation, to the whole world, to be honest.
2 minutes. Thank you. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is an important term. Collective punishment. Keep that in your mind. It was made popular by the Nazis in Europe. So when a resistance force attacked a German force, the whole village was burned to the ground, as Comrade said, and everybody was killed. That has not been used for years, except now. It's going on right this second in Gaza. It's called collective punishment. So because of the 1,200 that were attacked from the Israeli side, now they have killed the Israelis who are occupying Gaza, have killed almost 43,000 or something like that. So remember the term collective security. No other country has done that. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. Comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just to piggyback off of what Comrade was saying, if you look at this, also, it's not an accident that this propaganda barrage has been going on. In fact, it was deliberate from the end of the Cold War. In fact, this is just to be seen as the Cold War I. We're now in Cold War II. It's not an accident that they did that to serve the lie is what it is. So this is just kind of also interconnected to what Putin said in Munich, that he had NATO, he basically grabbed NATO by below the belt and said basically everything that, just really blew everything wide open what they were doing. And now it's just a sequence, of what's happening in Gaza as well as Ukraine.
60 seconds.
So if you look at this from the information warfare perspective, it's a requirement that the U.S. and NATO have done what they've done, but it all started well before the end of the first Cold War. It's pretty sad to look at, but we're going to come back stronger from it, provided we got the right people in the right positions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
I just wanted to say, while the term collective punishment was coined to describe what the Nazis did, and while it is certainly being done by the Israeli state today, there were several instances of both the US and UK conducting it during the Cold War, particularly against the Mau Mau uprising.
Thank
That's
you.
true.
That was Kenya, I believe.
Yeah, Kenya, that's right.
Yeah, in my opinion, the Cold War never ended. They just shifted their focus to Russia and China. In my opinion as well, NATO has continued the work of the Reich. The Third Reich, NATO is the Fourth Reich. Whether they want to admit it or not, there's fascism in their ideology. The founders of NATO were from Nazi Germany. Several of them were, and the stuff they're doing in Ukraine, Israel, and they support parties in other countries like Poland who are fascist, and anybody who's sending weapons to Ukraine. And it's a big threat to Europe right now, Eastern Europe especially. But until NATO is dismantled, there won't be no peace.
Thank you, Comrade. Put a paper clip in that. Comrade California, you have the floor.
Yeah, basically what's said here is correct. I had a conversation with someone last week. They said that the Soviet Union did not win World War II. And I said the Soviet Union took Berlin. And they said, no, the United States won World War II and the Russians helped. That's what we're dealing with. The origins of NATO pointed out correctly. Within Ukraine itself, these streets that are being renamed, the plaques that are being erected, these people, they did not fight for Ukrainian independence. These are Waffen-SS commanders. Everybody should look up the 14th Grenadier Waffen-SS division. It's the blue one with the lion. You'll see it all over the Ukraine. I've started to see now on their soldiers that wear a patch to match that lion in the yellow and blue. It's a little patch. It has two S's. It's the SS rune, and they do it in blue and yellow. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade Missouri, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, since we're talking about family, people that served in the war, and we mentioned Normandy, I didn't know this until last year, but my great uncle actually died in Normandy in, I think, like the 35th Infantry Platoon. I can't remember. But yeah, it's just crazy to think about that. People that close in my life were serving in that war. But that's all.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade, you have the floor.
Yeah, what did you say again about Second Cold War and everything? I missed part of that in your previous comment.
Yeah, so what I was saying is that, and I just want to add on to that as a correct lens, that for any of us, those of us who truly feel in our bones that we are Marxist-Leninists, the end of the First Cold War is not the end. It is just an armistice. It's not the end. It's just a chapter that unfortunately was a cheat that NATO created. The other thing I wanted to clarify, you asked, is that it was not an accident that the barrage, as Comrade said, of propaganda after, the end, that NATO refers to as the end of the Cold War. It was already there. In fact, I forgot the source, but in one book I read that now is being taken off of Huntington Beach library shelf, described how the plan was already there from when Truman first got in to begin a propaganda barrage should NATO arise victorious at the end and the Soviet Union is dismantled. That was already there from day one, started by Truman, but of course it was perfected over time. So it was an information warfare. Information warfare has been
90 seconds
perfected over time, unfortunately. So that's what I was trying to hint on. It's all interconnected.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right, we will go to our wrap up now, and we will close out tonight with D-Day by Nat King Cole.
Grab
yourself a chair and sit down, get you. Gonna hear some news of the military nature. Relax.